A rich and vibrant culture, a strong identity, living in harmony with Mother Earth. It's a history that dates back thousands of years. Intensity bears witness to the struggles of the past and the determination of the future. For centuries, First Nations people lived on the lands of North America. They were distinct, organized societies. On the prairies and in the northern forests, Cree, Saulteaux, Assiniboine, and Dene peoples had their own languages, cultures, spirituality, and laws. They shared a common relationship to their environment, to their Mother Earth. Long before Canada or Saskatchewan existed, First Nations and Europeans worked in partnership. The Hudson's Bay Company was established in 1670. The King of England granted the company a monopoly of the fur trade in all the land crossed by rivers draining into Hudson Bay. Europeans called that vast territory Rupert's Land. It encompassed the land across the prairies, as well as parts of northern Ontario and Quebec. From the earliest days of its trade, the Hudson's Bay Company established alliances with First Nations. While it had been granted a legal right to Rupert's Land under British law, the company's directors realized that British law meant nothing to the First Nations. For this reason, the employees were instructed to obtain the consent of the First Nations to occupy portions of their territories.
In fact, engaged in treaty-type relationships from the start. The employees were instructed, the representatives of the Hudson's Bay Company, when they arrived in Hudson Bay, were instructed to obtain permission to particular areas in order to build their posts and forts.
The company built alliances with First Nations through gift-giving and by participating in their cultural and spiritual ceremonies. It was a protocol that became part of the negotiations between the British Crown and First Nations. Those negotiations were part of a larger push by the British Crown to enforce order and to implement governmental structure in North America. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 set out terms to guide this alliance, especially for obtaining access to First Nations land. The proclamation made it clear that negotiations for land could only be conducted by the Crown or its representatives. For First Nations, the Royal Proclamation is seen as formal recognition of their nationhood. For the next century, the alliance between First Nations and European settlers continued to grow and solidify. After Confederation in 1867, Canada made it a priority to encourage settlement in the West.
And the form of development that they envisaged for the West was agricultural development. The West would become the grain-producing region, specializing in the growing and export of grains in particular that would be carried to export points over railways, and a region that would be supplied with consumer goods and farm machinery by, of course, Eastern manufacturers. So the West was seen as an important and an integral part of a complicated economic system that would make Canada a successful state.
In 1870, Canada came one step closer to its goal. The Hudson's Bay Company sold Rupert's Land to the Dominion of Canada, and that vast territory was incorporated into the country. But it was sold without consulting First Nations, a move that angered First Nations people. As land surveyors and settlers headed out west, conflict arose.
In 1875, in the Saskatchewan region, Cree groups interfered with the activities of both a telegraph laying party and a party of the Geological Survey of Canada, in effect telling those groups they had no right to be on Cree land without prior agreement.
Government officials in the West believed something had to be done to prevent conflict and to ensure that law and order would continue on the prairies. They saw treaties as a way to secure land for settlement. At the same time, First Nations also began to push for treaties for reasons of their own.
There was a lot of sickness and a lot of diseases that had come we had never understood before, and those were eradicating our people.
Diseases like smallpox and influenza spread to First Nations communities through contact with the Europeans. As well, years of a commercialized buffalo hunt meant the buffalo were disappearing.
Ayun sek de utna ke kiskaki. Kwawa. Paskwa musto se kiktamagi na into ay sino. Masksinzik.
Loss of livelihood and disease, two key reasons to enter into treaty negotiations. First Nations wanted a better future, and they had a powerful bargaining tool.
We had what they wanted. We had what you, the people who came from the other lands across the ocean, wanted. We had it here in abundance, and we were willing to share it.
Sharing the land in exchange for protecting their way of life and securing additional means of livelihood. It was to be a solemn undertaking.
In effect, that they were creating between the two nations a relationship that was similar to that which exists between brothers, an equal relationship, and yet one that signifies a certain kind of caring, a certain kind of nurturing, without one brother lording it over the other, so to speak. And it's a concept that originates from First Nation spiritual traditions, First Nation teachings, and particularly the laws governing the way in which relationships are have to be maintained and nourished over time.
In the late 1800s, the Government of Canada officially entered into treaty negotiations with First Nations on the prairies. Chiefs and headmen represented First Nations. They met with government officials to determine the legal framework of their partnership. They were joined by language interpreters and members of the newly founded Northwest Mounted Police.
In the Cree language, the word that is used is machihoan, meaning making a living. The people wanted to be very clear in the treaty relationship that they would be guaranteed the continuing right to maintain not only their connection or connectedness to the land, that newcomers would not come to deprive First Nation of these things.
From Canada's perspective, the numbered treaties would be used to obtain large tracts of land from First Nations and to establish friendly relations in return for promises of aid, including education, farming, hunting, medicine, and annual cash payments. Lieutenant Governor Alexander Morris was the chief negotiator for Canada.
Understand me. I do not want to interfere with your hunting and fishing. I want you to pursue it throughout the country, as you have heretofore done.
First Nations also saw education as a key to secure their livelihood.
You need not concern yourselves so much with what your grandchildren are going to eat. Your children will be taught, and they will be as well able to take care of themselves as the whites around them.
The written text of the treaties made provisions that schools would be set up on reserves. Reserves were another provision made in the treaties.
Now, what I and my brother commissioners would like to do is this. We wish to give each band who will accept of it a place where they may live. We wish to give you as much or more land than you need. We wish to send a man that surveys the land to mark it off, so you will know that it is your own and no one will interfere with you.
Between 1874 and 1906, 5 treaties were negotiated, legal documents that bind First Nations and the Government of Canada to a formal relationship.
I feel what we have done today a good work. The years will pass away and we with them. But the work we have done today will stand as the hills.
But even as the treaties were being negotiated, there were signs the partnership was breaking down. The Government of Canada introduced the Indian Act of 1876. It contained provisions that attempted to assimilate First Nations people into the culture of the newcomers. Residential schools were set up to teach First Nations children, even though the treaty agreement made provisions for First Nations to choose where and how their children would be educated. The schools focused on the culture and religion of the Europeans. Children were taken from their homes and families and were taught to resent their own culture. They were forced to learn the language and belief structures of the Europeans. At the same time, many First Nations leaders were imprisoned for practicing their own spirituality.
When I said we went through hard times, I'm not just talking going without food just one day. A lot of our people starved. A lot of our people died with disease that is curable, but they weren't looked after.
When Saskatchewan became a province in 1905, more than 100 treaties had been ratified in Canada. All are part of 5 treaties lied inside Saskatchewan's boundaries. The failure to implement the treaty relationship has hurt generations of First Nations families. The Indian Act was amended in 1951 to remove many restrictions placed on First Nations people. A decade later, First Nations were finally granted the right to vote in Canada. In 1989, a treaty commissioner was appointed to try to find a common path to the future. And in 1998, the Government of Canada issued a Statement of Reconciliation. The path has now been cleared to revive the treaty process.
I think the elders are very adamant and very clear that notwithstanding all of the problems, that a relationship was created through treaty, and that it is a relationship that is binding on both parties, the Crown and the First Nations, and neither has the option of abandoning or terminating that relationship. That they're very clear on.
The stage is now set for a new opportunity to build the treaty relationship. First Nations and the Government of Canada are forging a new alliance. They're looking at issues of the past as a bridge to the future. Their work may well determine the future for all of us. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow, we are all part of treaty.